Thank you, Sarah. Eagle was founded in 1994, and we are headquartered out of Dayton, Ohio, with offices in Florida, California, Washington, D.C., and Washington State. We provide SQF certification through our accreditation body of ANSI. In 2016, Eagle will grow to hold over 2,000 active certificates. We audit in 15 different countries, and we employ over 100 competent auditors. Eagle has 6 core markets: food safety, aerospace, medical device, health and safety, automotive, and environmental. Eagle's committed to the food industry, and we are actively involved with the following organizations: the Global Food Safety Initiative, where we help grow our auditors' competency technical working group and the accreditation task force. We are on the SQF and the Ethical Sourcing Committee. We have an active chair with the American Society for Quality in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Division. We also hold a co-chair in the Food Working Group for the IAF and a chair for the Food Task Force for IAAR. We are also on the FSSC Board of Stakeholders Group. Roger Roeth was SQF's Auditor of the Year in 2014. The award was based on leadership training activities, mentoring, improving auditing credentials, and promoting food safety. Eagle was also the SQFI Certification Body of the Year for 2011 and 2012. The award was based on delivering consistent, globally recognized food safety and quality certification programs based on sound scientific principles, consistently applied across all industry sectors and valued by all stakeholders. What sets Eagle apart is that each of our clients has a single point of contact to help with audit scheduling and the certification processes. We have ongoing competency training for all of our auditors and staff, over a 40% survey response rate with an overall rating of 4.55 out of 5. We also offer free training delivered through WebExes and presentations for all of our clients. If you have any questions or would like to contact Eagle, our information is listed below. And now I'd like to introduce Roger Roeth. Roger is the Executive Technical Officer for Eagle. He has over 30 years of experience in quality assurance, compliance, food safety, and food process manufacturing. He is a certified trainer for ISO 9001, FSSC 22000, and the SQF Lead Auditor course, as well as a lead auditor for these standards. Roger has conducted over 300 GFSI food safety audits. He's helped develop the food safety programs for Eagle. Prior to joining Eagle, Roger held the position of Director of Technical Services for Freshway Foods, General Manager and Food Safety ISO Manager for Whiteford Foods, and served as the Director of Quality Control and R&D for Spring Farms Company, a division of Sara Lee. His contributions include developing and implementing good agricultural practices, HACCP, and a corporate food safety program, as well as improved third-party audit scores, 50% reduction in customer complaints, and improved line efficiencies in product yields. Roger is a frequent speaker at the SQFI conference, local SIF chapter training programs, and various food and manufacturing conferences. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture from the Ohio State University, and Roger was also the Auditor of the Year in 2014. Please welcome Roger Roeth.
Thank you, Lindsay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking time out in some parts of the country and your lunch break to joining us today. So hopefully the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes will be a benefit to you. And what we're going to cover what we're going to try to cover, we're going to go over several different things. The first thing we're going to cover the intent, benefits, and requirements of both a business continuity plan and a recall plan. And a lot of the things, I'll warn you up front, a lot of things will sound familiar in both of them because a lot of the practices we're going to talk about, a lot of the ways to do the test are very similar for both of them. Then we're going to talk about how to conduct a robust test for both plans, and then the best way to document these tests and their results. And then lastly, we're going to look at the common failures that I've seen in plans as I do my audits. Now, unfortunately, I have been through 5 recalls in my career, so I do have experience in recalls and some of the issues that happen there. And I've also done over, like Lindsay said, 300 audits, and a lot of the stuff I've seen through different people's programs, both weak and strong programs, I'm hopefully going to be able to share with you today. So the intent of a business continuity plan. So the intent of the plan is developed on how to handle a crisis so your product is protected and your customer needs are handled. The plan is often confused with product withdrawal and a recall plan. These are 2 separate functions and programs. Requirements in the SQF for the business continuity plan is in 2.1.6, and for the recall, it's in 2.63. So it is required for both plans. The business continuity plan is more of a crisis plan that will address actions to be taken when some type of crisis occurs. These crises are defined by you, and that's probably a statement I'll make several times. You, as the supplier, define the crises that affect you. The focus is going to be on your customer and providing them with safe and quality products. The plan is going to address actual threats in your company. What are the threats and the potential of these threats to occur in your operation? And we're going to talk more about that in the next slide. Now, the business continuity plan is similar to a crisis plan. Many companies have modified their crisis plans and then covered the requirements in the code for identifying and segregating product for maintaining the supply to their customers. And that's the biggest difference between a crisis plan and a business continuity plan. The way it's written in SQF, it does require companies not only look at how the company is being handled in a crisis, but how is product protected for the customer. The business continuity plan is not a mandatory requirement of the code, but in all my audits, I've never seen anybody exempt out of this, and quite frankly, I think it would be a difficult one to exempt out because we all deal with crises. Even Eagle has a crisis plan developed. So what are the SQF requirements? Well, the first thing is you got to identify known threats. Weather, including hurricanes, tornadoes, snowstorms, floods, a pandemic, where there could be a large employee illness situation that could affect your operation in producing products, a fire, power outage, employee situation, maybe a disgruntled employee, a supply shortage, if you have some special ingredients that can't not be easily had. Avian influenza was a big issue for the poultry industry this past year. Also, maybe it's a terrorism event. These are all potential threats that possibly could affect your business. So you have to look at your business and what threats, and list those threats that could affect your plan. A lot of this depends on where you're at, where you live, where your location is, and the history of your facility. Now, the auditor may expect some threats to be on the list. Like I mentioned, avian influenza would be something I would expect to see in egg-laying facilities because that's a big issue right out there now. But for a plastic manufacturing facility, I wouldn't expect them to have an avian influenza because it doesn't affect their business. But I would expect them to have a good fire plan in place because the mold presses operate at high temperatures. Therefore, they are subject to some fires inside the facility. So they need to have a plan in place on how to address those fires. Plants on the East Coast need to identify hurricane, as that's going to be a threat on that part of the country, but they might not have to identify tornadoes or earthquakes because that's not a threat. So based upon your location, based upon your history, based upon your industry, you have to identify those threats that are a potential to happen at your facility. It's going to be different for each company. Even if you belong to a corporation, you might have different threats at Plan A as you would at Plant B based upon location. Then you have to identify the team. Generally, this is the management team. For small companies, it may be the same team as your recall team. Now, this sometimes gets kind of cloudy when we talk about corporate plans. Corporate generally will have a corporate team in place, but that corporate team should also include people at that specific site. And we'll talk about that throughout this presentation, looking at corporate plans and how it needs to include site personnel and site responsibilities. Roles need to be identified in your business continuity plan. You have to identify a senior manager who's responsible for decision-making, oversight, and initiating actions arising from an incident. And again, corporate plans have to involve people at that site. You also have to train the team. And a lot of times these trainings are done at the same time you're performing the exercise. So the code calls out later. We'll talk about review, testing, and verify. Well, that review part can be part of that training for your team. And you want to do it in that order. Review, look at your plan, then do your test, and then do the verification of that test. So other requirements of the code. You have to define management responsibilities. What's the role of the president, quality control, production manager, HR, sales, maintenance staff? What roles do they have in handling communication, rescheduling production, transportation, staffing, putting product on hold, evaluating that product that was on hold? Who's responsible to get the plant cleaned up if something like a fire occurred? These all have to be defined, and these roles have to be identified. Another best practice that I've seen when I've gone into facilities that have strong business continuity plans is they identify the backups. And this is a good practice to have. A crisis generally does not occur when no one is on vacation. So it's important to identify backups for each role and have them trained and be familiar with the program. If they can't be a part of the actual test just due to the number of people in that test, at minimum they should read over the business continuity plan test results and have an understanding of the program. So the program also requires that they have to ensure product safety. As I mentioned earlier, this is probably the one big difference between a crisis plan and a business continuity plan in the SQF program. You have to ensure product safety. What measures or controls do you have implemented to respond to a crisis where the safety or quality of that product is not compromised? You got to have a release of product. What measures do you have to isolate and identify the product that's effective? It may reference your hold program. I see that a lot in business continuity plans. Again, that depends on your situation and how your company is set up. If you follow different steps in a crisis than what you would do for a normal non-conforming product or equipment situation, then it should be defined specifically in your plan. If you use non-conforming product procedure and you reference that in your business continuity plan, make sure it is a strong program. Because one of the common issues I see in non-conforming product and equipment programs is no one's identified with the authority to remove product from hold. For a business continuity plan, that needs to be clearly defined in one of the roles. You also have measures taken to verify acceptability of product for release. Make sure the documentation is there to support the decision. Again, one of the biggest failures with a non-conforming product program is that documentation of who has the authority and also showing that documentation on that release form. So they must have that authority clearly defined. The bottom line is, how is your customer protected? How is their supply needs with quality and safe product provided? You know, many companies have the benefit of sister companies, while others may have multiple sites within the corporation. Other plants that are smaller might have agreements that are worked out with people who are normally their competition, but in a serious crisis situation, they might have something in a contractual agreement that says, hey, if I can't make this product for my customer so I can keep the supply chain in place, can you make that for me? I've seen that in various situations too. And then also methods of recovery, salvage, and destruction should be described in your plan. This is one of the common things I see missing when I look at business continuity plans. For example, if you have a fire from a cooking oven, and equipment is damaged, how are you going to handle that? Or how are you going to handle the cleaning up of the area that is affected by that fire? You've got product that's going to be affected by the smoke damage. You've got packaging materials. How is that going to be evaluated? How is that going to be disposed of? And again, in many situations, you might have to provide evidence of disposal, and we'll talk about that more when we get into the recall plan. Some more requirements of the code is development and maintenance of a crisis contact list. On this contact list, you need to include your crisis team. That's your internal team, generally which is the management team. If corporate's involved, it should include the corporate and site personnel for that team. Local groups, fire, police, the emergency squad, those type of groups should be on that list. Regulatory, EPA, FDA, USDA, they need to be on that list. Sources of legal and expert advice. Your legal counsel and possibly a consultant or industry expert should be included on your contact list. It may also be someone from a trade organization you're involved with. I have been directly involved in trade organizations in meat, egg, and the produce industry, and I know they have staff available that's able to help you out in a time of a crisis. So have that contact information readily available for you if you're a member of these organizations. Then you have to ensure the list is maintained and current. This is one of the areas that I see that's commonly missing when I do audits. People don't have a good system in place to where they ensure that this list is current. So many times when companies go through their actual situation, they find out a lot of these numbers or contact information is outdated. So then they have to take time out from the crisis or time out from their recall and try to look up this information, which takes time out of other things they could have been doing that's more effective. So one of the things you need to do with is you need to set someone up who is responsible, who's going to maintain that contact list. It may be multiple people depending on the contact information. One person may cover customer contact lists, one person may cover regulatory, and you might have another person for suppliers. But you should have some system in place to make sure that this contact list is maintained because it is a common nonconformance. Best practice, again, is to verify prior to the exercise that the contact information of the team and external groups are current. You can verify the team by actually calling the numbers, because these are your own people that work for the corporation or for your company. You can either call them or send them an email, say, give me your new updated contact information, just to make sure you have the most current on the list. And then you can verify the external group by calling or emailing them to ensure you have that most current contact information from them also. But you need to make sure you have a system in place to keep that list current. The SQF code also requires some type of communication process for both internal and external groups. This means the methods and responsibilities need to be defined. So how are you going to communicate to your internal staff if there's a crisis that they need to be aware of? How are you going to communicate to the regulatory? Who is going to have that role and that responsibility? That has to be defined. And then one of the biggest challenges that I see when I do audits is the annual activity, the annual requirement. And I have up here on the side that says train, and actually it should say test. Training is a part of that test. So you have to test, review, and the verification of the plan on an annual basis. And you'd be surprised how many times I have written nonconformances because that isn't done in a timely manner. So the training, as I mentioned, is a part of that test. And again, you should actually read the plan. I find out a lot of people don't even read their own business continuity plan. And when you ask them questions about different scenarios, they don't even know what exists in their plan. So the first thing I would do as far as before you train, you do the review, and you have everybody on that team review the plan, and that can be part of your training. So you go over your team prior to the exercise. Is there any adjustments that need to be made or updates that need to be identified? And then you perform the test. Create a scenario based upon the threats you have identified. When you set up your program, you have identified those threats that could potentially affect your operation. So select one of those. and in 2016, do a test of one threat, and then rotate those threats in coming years. So the idea is that each time you do an exercise, you're doing a different threat. Every year, you're not doing power outage. Because what happens, rotating the exercise to different threats helps you create stronger plans for each one, because I can assure you that during that test, you will find a gap that will need to be fixed. So rotating it, covering all the different threats you have, will give yourself a stronger program, so if something happens, you're going to be better prepared. And then involve the entire team. Again, include backups if possible, but also create a sign-in sheet for evidence of those who participated. So especially when the auditor goes in there, or even for your own use, you know who was a part of that test, so if anybody on your team that missed it, you can get back with them and share the results of the test. But have some type of evidence of sign-in sheet. And again, document the activity. It says records have to be maintained. And we'll talk about this in greater detail later, but one of the biggest mistakes and common failures I see in business continuity plan tests is records aren't maintained to demonstrate that the plan had truly been tested. So some of these documents may include a summary report of kind of summarizing what the test was and what were the results of that test. A narrative of the activity, going in detail, who was assigned what task, what were the discussions throughout the test, the tabletop exercise, going in detail what was discussed. Sometimes people use the plan themselves, and they have the plan, and they write off comments right on that plan that this person did this activity or this activity was done at this time, and also keep extra notes from that. They might develop a checklist based upon the plan that they can follow, and as they do the business continuity plan test, they can follow along with the checklist. That is the one I prefer the most because you can build those checklists off your plan. It gives yourself enough room to write what was done and actually done. And actually, these checklists are very valuable not only for documenting the mock exercise, but also very valuable if you do have a crisis plan or a crisis situation of documenting the activities you did in that activity. Also create examples of communication, announcement letters, or maybe draft emails. Creating the basic part of the communication allows you to have the communication read clearer, and then all you have to do when the actual crisis hits is to fill in the blank. And you'll probably hear the same comment in the recalls because this is the same example or the same expectation I would have for the recalls. And then lastly, review that exercise. This is where many companies fail. They fail to look back at that exercise and say, hey, what went well? What did not go well? Do we have to create an action plan or initiate a non-conformance against our test because it didn't do well? This is a great way to document continuous improvement, which is a requirement of the code, and which is an area where many companies struggle in having documentation that, hey, we're continually improving our SQF program. So review the exercise. And again, records need to be maintained. One of the commonly asked questions I have is, can an actual situation be used as a mock exercise, or can it fill the requirement of doing that business continuity plan test? And this is Roger's opinion. And in my opinion, it is, yes, they can. But I would still recommend doing a test, because as we discussed, there are benefits from doing a test and practicing. But if you have a true life situation and you document it like you would a test, and then you would review it at a later time to evaluate your performance, then I think it would be acceptable to use as your test for a business continuity plan. So what are the benefits of the plan? And maybe I should have started off with this first, but I like jumping into requirements right away. It's preparing you for a crisis. You do not have to create a plan in a time of crisis. This never goes well, as most people don't think well on their feet in the middle of a stressful situation. I'm one of those people. I'm surely going to forget something in a stressful situation. And if it's not written down, it's probably not going to happen. So if you have something planned and developed ahead of time and you've got all the details filled in, there might be just minor things that you might miss. So it helps you prepare for a crisis. Again, each type of crisis is different. has different methods to handle and manage, so you should evaluate and create methods that cover all the potential threats. For example, a power outage may be handled differently than the issue with the weather that shuts down your operations or damages your facility. You know, a power outage might have effects on refrigeration, so you have to look at what do I need to do to keep my product refrigerated, where a weather situation, if it's a snowstorm, you might not have people come into your facility, so now you've got to look at that from a different standpoint. So each crisis might have different methods and different things you have to look at. It allows for a smooth handling of a crisis. It minimizes the damage and allows for transparency with the community, which for a business continuity plan you got to be concerned about, and your supplier and your customers and regulatory bodies. It shows you are in control. And then one of the things that happened to me, it's a personal situation. I worked for a ground beef facility, and we had an ammonia leak one time. And we did have a crisis plan in place, but it wasn't very well written, and it had not been practiced or even reviewed. So needless to say, we did have a ammonia leak one time. And we had to search for the plan, so it wasn't readily accessible, and none of the team understood their roles. We had to look, and we really struggled through the whole plan. It slowed our reaction time, and it also caused us to make several wrong decisions throughout the process. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the whole situation did not go well. How we handled that ammonia leak was not a pretty picture. We were running around like chickens with our heads cut off. So we reviewed the crisis. We looked at what we did wrong and what could we do later. And actually, we had another ammonia leak a year later. And because we practiced and because we updated our plan and we looked at our plan and made some revisions, we were better prepared this time. We were more prepared that even one of the local firemen came and says, boy, you guys seemed like you handled this a lot better than the first time. That's the benefits of having a business continuity plan in place and being prepared and practicing the plan. It protects your product so there are no food safety or quality issues. You can make it a part of your whole program or make your whole program a part of the business continuity plan, or you might have to have separate procedures in place. You don't want to make the situation worse by sending out product that was affected by your crisis. So you want to make sure you can control that. And then you got to maintain supply of product to the customer. Provide that transparency. Again, I mentioned it earlier. If you have a company, has sister companies, they might be able to keep the supply chain filled for your customers. Or if you're by yourself, again, I've seen places where they've had mutual relationships with their competition or someone else close by who can fill in and fill the pipeline until they can get up running again. But protect your customer. The next thing I want to talk about is common findings during the audit. As I mentioned earlier, I've done over 300 audits. GFSI, that includes SQF and FSSC, and these are just common things I see with business continuity plans. Threats aren't identified. Again, like I mentioned earlier, avian influenza should be something that was identified in your egg-laying facility. That's a huge threat to your operation. Again, different companies are at different locations, and that may add or remove threats from their operation. For example, if you're on the East Coast, then hurricanes should be on your list. If your plant is in the Mississippi, near the Mississippi River, then flooding should be on that list. Now, does each weather situation need its own method on how you're going to handle? Possibly no if your processes are the same. But if it's different on how you would handle and respond, then yes, you should have something at least spelled out that, hey, for a flood, we would do this and we would contact this individual. And for a plant closing due to a snowstorm or a hurricane, this is how this would be handled. So it depends upon how you would handle those type of situations. You know, one size does not fit all. Many companies have just one method to handle all the threats, and that generally will not work. A fire may require one method of control, while a power outage incident requires another. You know, again, like I mentioned earlier, a power outage, if you have refrigerated products, is going to have problems with your coolers maintaining temperature. So you might have to look at where do we have to go, where we can put this product in the interim until we get our coolers up and running. Well, for a weather situation, if it's just people coming in, or for a fire, if it's a fire, maybe that doesn't affect your cooler, but it affects other parts of your business, and the big concern there is segregating product or packaging materials that might have been affected by that fire, or segregating the area that had the fire. so you don't have contamination being crossed over by people's traffic or by product traffic. So different issues, different hazards are created by different threats. You need to evaluate that. Preparedness is the key. You want to minimize the surprises. Another common issue is contact list is not current. You got to actually check the numbers. We talked about this earlier. Make someone responsible for maintaining this list and have them verify annually or more frequently if necessary. The tested system is not complete. This is probably the #1 nonconformance for business continuity plan test. People, especially the first 1 or 2 years I went out and audit, people did a fire drill, and it was just an evacuation drill of the employees, and that was their business continuity test. They did nothing else as far as putting product on hold, reviewing product, looking at, do I have to clean equipment? They just made sure people left the plant in an orderly fashion, and they timed it. That does not constitute a business continuity plan test. It can be part of the test, but it cannot be the whole test. You've got to look at your plan, you've got to look at the requirements of the code and cover each section, each piece, and show, which is the next problem, records of the test, and show that you covered them in your documentation. Because one of the next issues I have is records of tests are not complete. The documentation is weak. There's no evidence that each part of the plan or the requirement was tested. So example of what you can do as far as documenting the exercise will use this similar to those described in the mock recall, which we'll talk about later, and which we talked about a little bit about creating a checklist, maybe also creating a mock press release or some evidence that you contacted companies. Using these things, creating these records will help you show evidence that you conducted the mock recall. Evaluation of the test not being performed. Now, this is not necessarily a nonconformance because it's not a requirement of the code. But again, it's a good way to show continuous improvement. And again, you do these tests to get better. So if you just do the test and you can mark off your list, well, we did the business continuity test, we're not going to get a nonconformance this year. That's not the right approach. That's not the right attitude. You need to do these tests so you're better prepared, so if you ever have a crisis, you can handle that crisis with less stress and more transparency. So review the test. How did it go? Was there any issues? Was there anything we could do better? And then address your problems through your corrective action plan. And that would be a good way, again, to show continuous improvement in your system. So next I want to talk about the withdrawal and recall plan. And again, I apologize up front, but there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to hear again that, well, didn't Roger say that for the business continuity plan? And that'll be true because they mirror each other so closely, and some of the best practices and some of the requirements, they follow along right with each other. So, but I think sometimes it's a benefit to hear things a couple times because then it sinks in. At least that's what my wife tells me. Anyhow, the recall program, again, the intent is similar to the business continuity plan because you got to have a plan in place before an issue occurs. You want to have a plan so it minimizes the impact of a recall. When I was in the ground beef business, the president of our company would always say, it is not if we have a recall, but when we have a recall. And that's the way it is with all high-risk products. It's probably not going to be if, and we don't want to hear that we're going to have one, but it's probably going to be when. So you be prepared. It is a mandatory requirement of the SQF code. It has the capital M next to the requirement, which means you have to develop, implement a recall plan for your operation. No ifs, ands, buts about it. You have to have a recall plan in place. You will find as we go over the plan, there's a lot of similarities. And when I audit, I generally cover both of these items at the same time because that's the frame of mind I'm in. So when I'm looking at the business continuity plan test, I'll also look at the recall test at the same time because they have so many similarities. So we're going to look at the definition for withdrawal and recall. We're going to look at the standard requirements. We're going to look at the benefits of the plan. And we're going to look at common findings during the audit. So the two definitions I have for withdrawal and recall come from the definitions in the SQF Module 2 guidance. So this is specifically how SQF has defined a withdrawal and a recall in their guidance document. A withdrawal is dispatched product is found not to meet safety or quality requirements and has been withdrawn from the distribution train before it has reached the consumer. A recall is product is unsafe or in breach of regulatory requirements and is withdrawn from the consumer market. Advised not to use or consume the product. That is the definitions. Now I'm going to veer off a little bit from topic because one of the common mistakes I see in a facility when I speak of definitions, there's a section in the code called the glossary. It's Appendix 2. This is one of the most seldom used sections of the code, but it's invaluable to help you understand specific requirements of some of the elements. For example, I'm going to give you 3 examples that I commonly find people miss the target because they don't go back and refer to the definitions. The first one is HACCP training. People really struggle, well, what is acceptable HACCP training? Well, it is defined in the glossary. It has a requirement specifically that spells out what is an acceptable training, and there's 4 specific requirements. And I'm not going to go over those 4 specific requirements, but it's clearly identified what's acceptable in the definitions or the glossary section. Rework. I was looking at the definition for rework the other day, and again, I've done 300 audits, and one of the things that jumped out at me that I've never seen before was it includes work in progress materials. So if you've had any WIP products, WIP products, then you need to be treating them and they need to be part of your rework plan because that is defined in the glossary as part of rework. And then high-risk food. Not only does it include pathogens, with a change of 7.2, it now includes allergens. And some of the requirements for high risk in the code may include an allergen situation now because allergens are part of the definition of high-risk food. So that was just a side note talking about using the glossary, being aware of that glossary, because it helps you understand what might be some of the requirements for the requirements in the SQF code. So get back to task and talk about recalls and withdrawals. So recalls may be mandatory, customer-driven, or voluntary. Under FSMA, FDA will have the ability to mandate recalls. Now, in the past, I know many of you say, well, they've always had that ability. Well, they would strongly suggest, but a lot of times, most of the recalls that we have are of a voluntary nature. In the future, it could be a mandatory recall. Some of us have gone through customer-driven recalls, maybe based upon a quality issue. And then voluntary, which is where most of our recalls fall currently. Companies recall to minimize the impact of a potential issue to their customers, to protect their brand, and also to reduce potential lawsuits. And again, safety of their customers is number one. Now, there's different levels of a recall, and I'm going to go over those definitions real quick. And I've kind of combined FDA and USDA definitions because they're very similar. A Class 1 recall is defined as for dangerous or defective products that predictably could cause serious health problems or death. When you look at USDA, it says reasonable probability. Examples of this could fall into the category could be food with undeclared allergens, the presence of pathogens in ready-to-eat meat, the presence of E. coli 0157 in raw ground beef, the presence of listeria in ready-to-eat products, anything that could cause a serious health problem. Class 2 recalls are for products that might cause a temporary health problem, a remote probability, or pose only a slight threat of a serious nature. Example of this might be under USDA, maybe they might classify an undeclared allergen with very small amounts, typically associated with milder reactions such as wheat or soy might fall in that category, or maybe a small-sized or non-sharp form material which would not cause adverse effects would fall under a Class 2 recall. Then Class 3 recalls are for products that are unlikely to cause any adverse health reaction but violate FDA or USDA labeling or manufacturing regulations. Again, this might involve a container defect, maybe packaged material delaminating or a lid that does not seal. Maybe it's an off taste. Maybe there's a color issue. Maybe there's leak in a bottled drink. Maybe it's lack of English labeling in a retail food. Maybe it's an undeclared ingredient, such as an excess water in meat and poultry. but it's something that's not going to cause an adverse health effect. So what are the standard requirements? Well, you have to have methods to conduct a recall withdrawal. These methods and responsibilities must be documented and they must be implemented. A best practice not only to develop the methods, but also to include sample letters or recall notices or customer letters or any other form of communication in with your plan. Again, create these templates ahead of time so you just have to fill in the blank when a real situation occurs. So you don't have to think on how you should word that document. If it is a corporate plan, then there should be site responsibilities defined. The plan still needs to be accessible by the site, and they should have some roles in that plan. Generally, tracing a product is a site-specific responsibility. Placing product on hold is a site-specific responsibility. Sometimes the site's responsible for contacting the CB and the SQFI. Maybe internal communication. And generally, investigation is a site responsibility. So corporate plans should have them built into the plan, and if they don't, then the site should have an addendum to the recall plan that tells and spells out their responsibilities. You need to define responsibilities to initiate, to manage, to investigate. Who is going to do what in the recall? One of the best programs I saw was a table that showed each member of the recall. It also included another tab, their backup, and then it listed their responsibilities for that recall. It was kind of like a mini job description for recalls. It was really well done. The SQF code is not specific on what the role should be or what the process should be. It's very vague. So you need to develop and you need to modify your plan to make sure all the areas are covered. There's some really, if you're really lost, there's some really good examples out on the internet. USDA has an excellent example on their website on how to develop a recall plan. Now, the only problem with that plan, it does a nice job with the process, but it doesn't do a good job with identifying the roles of each team member. And that's located on the website for USDA FSIS. You also need to define the management procedures. What is the process? And one of the common parts of the process that you miss is disposition. So how are you going to handle it when you get product back? How is that product segregated? How is it dispositioned? Because you want to make sure that this product is not lost out of control. You also want to provide how you're going to provide evidence of waste. So if you dispose of this product and you throw it away, you need to have some type of evidence showing that you threw it away and you disposed of it. Whether it's a disposal, a waste receipt from the people who got rid of the product for you, some method needs to be there. And that needs to be written into your program. How are you going to do this? How are you going to manage that? The investigation. You have to define who is going to be responsible for investigating and how the investigation will be conducted. Why did the recall occur? This is a common issue I see when I go into plans. Many times I see the investigation of the actual recall itself, and all it includes is how much product was produced and shipped and just involves the traceability. And that's what they include as their investigation. You need to know that the code requires you to investigate the cause of why you had that recall. Was it an allergen, undeclared allergen on your label? Why did that happen? So you need to go through a root cause analysis process and an investigation that comes and helps you find a root cause to that specific situation. This will also be a requirement of your certification body. So if you ever have a recall, you're probably going to get a letter from your certification body that says, hey, we need corrective actions from this recall. So you have to do a root cause analysis for that certification body so they have evidence that you're in control of the situation and that your cert won't be in jeopardy. And then at the next recertification audit, or depending on the seriousness of the situation, an auditor is going to come in, maybe at an audit before your recertification audit, but sometime during that process, at their next audit, they're going to verify that your corrective actions were implemented and that they were effective. So to sum it up, you need to do a root cause of the recall, you need to document the actions that were taken, and you must verify that those actions were actually implemented and that they're effective in controlling the problem that you identified. And again, I always recommend companies to use the regular CAPA process, their corrective action, preventive action process that they have in place, and use the form that you've developed. This is a good use of that form. Some more standard requirements. Communication plan is developed, so you need to include the CB and SQFI. And it says in the code within 24 hours you need to communicate them in writing. So include their email addresses in your plan or in your contact list. No communication to your CB or to SQFI could result in a major nonconformance at your next audit. The SQFI contact information is foodsafetycrisis@sqfi.com. This is documented in Section 5.3 and Part A of the code. The CB may also have a special contact number or email address. For example, Eagles is foodsafety@eaglecertificationgroup.com. The reason we do this, and many other CBs might do the same thing, is this email address goes to several staff members. So if someone is on vacation or out of the country for a seminar or a conference, then it's gone to multiple people, and someone can act on it within the certification body's organization. So check with your CB. See if they have a special contact information. Many suppliers have called their auditors, and they stop there. The code requires to contact your certification body, not the auditor, and you have to do this in writing. Another requirement of the code is test the plan. You got to review it, you got to test it, and you got to verify it. And just like the business continuity plan, I recommend you do it in that order. You review the plan, so that can be part of your training of your team. Then you test the plan, and then you verify the plan by going over and discussing and reviewing the results of that activity. Records have to be maintained for both an actual recall or mock recall. Most companies do a great job of retaining mock recall records, but sometimes the actual recall records are not properly maintained and are not complete. Records at minimum should include the time it took to complete and the percent recovery, trace information, a summary of how much was produced, shipped, and is still on the site if you didn't ship everything. It should also include records that are generated for the run, like trace records, QA test records, HACCP records, sanitation, shipping and receiving records, and maybe disposal records. As we talked about the disposal, you have to have evidence that that recall product was destroyed. And then all these records should be on file and readily available. Sometimes I go into facilities that have had recalls, these records are not readily available, and that is a requirement of the code. So what are the benefits of a recall plan? Well, very similar to the business continuity plan. It prepares you for a recall. The plan is developed and it's tested. I'm a huge football fan, and I like to create analogies. So I look at it the same way as a football team preparing for their next game. First, they develop a game plan. They set up defensive plays, they set up offensive plays. So they develop that game plan. Very similar to you developing your recall plan. Then they take that plan and they share it with the players. And the players read that plan over again till they understand it. That's training your people. You take your recall plan and yet your people review it so the team understands the plan and understands there's rules. And then they go out there and they take that game plan and they practice it on the field. They practice that play over and over again until it runs smoothly. That's doing your annual test. Practicing that recall plan over and over again until it runs smoothly, and you're acting out of just, you know how to handle it, and you don't have to stop and think because time is of the essence. So again, if corporate handles your program, and I've gone in many sites that says, well, we don't have any responsibilities. Corporate handles all of our recall. I really struggle with that because the sites do have responsibilities, and those sites should be defined. Again, this is a common issue. That's why I'm constantly bringing it up, because I see this as a constant problem with corporate entities not involving the sites or the sites not having any responsibilities to the corporate plan. And at minimum, they're going to have some responsibilities. You do not have to develop a plan in the heat of a crisis. In a crisis situation, you got customers, you got FDA or USDA and other people breathing down your neck. I had a gentleman give a presentation one time in the produce industry, and he said, you never feel stressed until you have FBI coming in with machine guns wanting to know information about your recall, because they treated it as a threat, as a terrorist type situation. And he says you never understand the high stress levels you have when you have someone there standing with a gun, watching you go looking for records that you can't find right away. So be prepared. It's easier to read steps than creating steps through a crisis. A recall plan is required by FSMA. Many are required by your customers. I reviewed a lot of supplier programs during the audits, and many of you guys require your suppliers to have a recall plan in place. It also helps protect the brand and the company if the recalls are managed well. If they're managed well and things are ran smoothly, it shows well in the company. If it's ran not well and the company has to keep coming back and recalling more stuff and it looks like they're not in control, and it doesn't show good on the company. And also, too, having a benefit of a recall plan is aids in handling the media. And 5 or 6 years ago, you only had to worry about the newspaper and the TV. Now it's social media you got to be concerned about. You have to include that. You know, we had a client who just recently threw a recall, and they had a friend that texted them before they had officially announced the recall. They text them, hey, how's the recall going? And that's before they officially announced it. So you need to be prepared on how to handle stuff in a social media. Now, that's not a requirement of the code, but that's a benefit of having a well-written recall program. One of the hardest things I did, I was a spokesperson for our recall plan when I was at Wyford Foods. And we went through training where we hired a consultant who came in and let us issue a statement, a recall statement. So we had a prepared statement we issued. And I did pretty good on that part, but then he started asking questions that newspaper people would answer. And I normally consider myself to be fairly good in front of a crowd and spontaneously, and I did horrible. I sunk as fast as a sinking ship. It was not good. I crashed and burned. So again, be prepared, practice. And I did prepare. We practiced later on. We did that 2 or 3 more times, and by the 3rd or 4th time, I was doing a lot better than that first time that I did it. And again, if you have someone that's a spokesperson, one of the nice practices doing was videotape it. Look at that videotape, review, critique what you did wrong, and go back and do it again. So common findings during the audit. Methods aren't completely defined. Many times I go in and I see generic plans, they're not site-specific, and even includes positions that don't even exist at the facility. So make sure that your plans aren't just copied from the USDA website, aren't copied from the FDA website, that these are plans that you can use those as base plans, but you make that plan fit your organization and satisfy the requirements of the code. It has to be your plan. Also, too, investigation of the actual cause of recall is not defined in the plan. Who's going to investigate? What are some of the things they're going to use to investigate a recall? Include that into your plan. Document that. That has to be the methods and responsibilities. Roles are not clearly defined. Again, just with like the business continuity plan, best practice is to define backups. If your plan is small, it may be extended roles of the current team. So maybe if you have someone missing on that day of a recall, then maybe the quality person is going to cover maybe the shipping person's responsibility. You might have to spread the wealth, so to say, if someone's missing. But try to involve your backups. Again, corporate plan still needs to have site responsibilities. We talked about this earlier. Investigation will be a site responsibility. Actually doing the trace activities will be a site responsibility. Contact the SQFI and the CB. Place product on hold. These are all site responsibilities that should be identified in the plan. Communication does not include the certification body and the SQFI contact information, even though this has been in Module 2 since 7.2 was introduced. We just had some audits just in the last week or so that had minor non-conformances because they were missing some contact information for the certification body. That is required. It's spelled out in two separate areas in the code. 2.4.1.3 says in case of a food safety event that requires public notification, you have to communicate to SQFI and your certification body. In 2.6.3.1.4, again, it talks about if you have a recall or a food safety event, you have to notify your SQFI and your certification body. Spelled out in two separate elements of the code. For more details, it's also spelled out in 5.3 Part A of the code. And that goes into more detail stating that you have to notify SQFI and your certification body within 24 hours in writing. So when it says in writing, on your contact list, it should include the email address that you have to send this information to for both the certification body and for SQFI, and I shared that with you earlier. CB is responsible to notify SQF of any intended action within 48 hours. So there might be an action like maybe a suspension or something like that might occur because of this recall. We have to notify SQF in that time frame. A corporate plan, again, we talked about not identifying responsibilities. The more common findings, records incomplete, as they do not indicate a mock recall was conducted. You need to include mock communications such as a media release, letter notifications, a completed checklist. And we're going to talk more about that later because one of the most common issues I have is people, whether it's auditors, facility personnel, get confused with trace exercise and a mock recall. Two separate activities, and we're going to talk about that in a little more detail on the next slide. Mock recall was only conducted by one person. It should include the recall team. It does not meet your customer requirements. You know, a lot of times frequency is defined in the code as being annual, but if your customer has a requirement that you have to do it more than annually, then you need to do it more annually, and that's part of the code because it's tied into the code because in element 2.1.1, the management's policy says, it states that senior management, at minimum, outline the methods used to comply with its customer and regulatory requirements. So if a customer has a special requirement for recall, that falls into that part of the code. So you have to meet that requirement. The SQF guidance document alludes to this in section 2.63 about the supplier needing to be aware of recall targets set by your client. For example, your client might say 100% recovery in 4 hours, because that is a common target that I see throughout the industry. So if that's the case, you have to fulfill that for your customer. Now, the SQF code doesn't make any specifications like that. There's no specific requirements on how fast you need to have the mock recall done or the trace exercise done, but that is a common activity. A mock recall is only a trace exercise. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk about other issues that might happen. The plan is not readily available by the team. I went into a facility and I was asking questions about to one of the recall members. And I asked them, can you get to the recall plan? And it was in a computer database, it was in their system, it was in their document control, and they could not find it. So make sure you have a system in which the recall plan is readily available to the recall team. And this can be done through the system, and it also can be done by printing out copies for each one of the recall members and having it stationed at their desk. I found that to be very effective when I used to work in the industry. We had a recall folder, too, that was on the computer system, and it was called Recall. So you went to that folder, and it had the procedure. It had also methods on tracing the materials, that type of stuff. It had everything that we needed right in that folder in our database. So we'll get into probably the most highly confusing thing when we're talking about mock recalls, and that's the trace exercise versus the mock recall. Both are required by the code. So if they're both required, you have to do both of them. The standard calls out performing both a mock recall and a trace exercise. There are two specifically different elements so you need to do both. A trace may be a part of the mock recall, but is not the only thing that should be included in your mock recall. The trace exercise only addresses how product is tracked. Usually the requirement is one up and one back. Mock recall also needs to include on how you handle communication and other aspects involved in a recall. Basically practicing your procedure and having evidence that you practice that procedure. A trace is going to follow raw materials from raw material to finished product to end user, or from finished product to raw material to supplier. It's also going to include packaging and process aids. Timing is generally, the people look at that for being 4 hours, 100% recovery. Again, the code does not define what that trace exercise or mock recall requirement should be. But the mock recall is going to include the trace exercise, but it's also going to include following your recall plan with all the rules carried out. Who calls the customer? Now, you don't have to call the customer because that's going to cause confusion, but who would do that in that time? Who's going to identify what customers have to be called? Who's going to communicate to regulatory? Who's going to send the email to SQF and the certification body? Fill those out in your record. Perform each step of your process and document that step has been performed and who performed it. Get the whole team involved. When I see just the QA manager doing the mock recall, a little flag pops up that says they probably didn't do a mock recall, they probably did a trace exercise, because how can you do a mock recall with just the QA manager or just the shipping manager? The whole team has to be involved. And then you have to have a record. You have to have a record that supports you did a mock recall. And again, I'm going to repeat myself because it's very similar to the business continuity plan. Use your procedure. Have your procedure written out and document on that procedure form. At the least, you can do that. Who did this activity? What time was this activity performed? That could be one method of documentation. Another, again, is developing a checklist based upon your recalled method. This is the one I think works out best for both you to review and to verify, and also to keep track of what's going on. Develop that checklist based upon your recall procedure. Maybe a narrative. This is one I used in the recalls that I had, was every step of the process we wrote notes. I had someone who was a note keeper during our recall meetings. And when we met and we would initiate a recall, they would start keeping track of every step of the process. What time did someone do this? Do the same thing for your mock recall. Keep a track, keep a diary, a narrative of that activity. Include sign-in sheets for those that are participating. Include as part of the records, and I see people do a pretty good job at this, they include other records like QA records, sanitation records, shipping records, receiving records, HACCP records, records that are involved with that product that is having to be recalled. And then include a summary page. This summary page should include information like % recovery rate. An auditor shouldn't have to look through your records and calculate the recovery rate himself. That's something that should be calculated by you, especially if you have customer requirements. But even if you don't have customer requirements, you could have targets. How are you going to know if you're getting better or improving if you don't have targets? So recovery rate, the time it took to complete the audit or complete the mock recall, the amount of product that was produced, shipped, or on site, members who participated in, and then comments on what went well and what didn't go well. These should be included on the summary page. And again, I highly recommend, just like with the business continuity plan, do a review of your mock recall. Get your team involved. Do it a couple days after, or maybe do it right after you do a mock recall, and say, guys, what happened? What happened with our mock recall? What went well? What went bad? What struggled? So discuss that and look at that. And then if you have to issue a non-conformance, issue a non-conformance against yourself and put a strong corrective action in place. Again, that non-conformance record shows continuous improvement. Lastly, I just want to share comments that I've gotten back from customers that I've dealt with who had strong recall programs in place. And this is some of their comments. I was better prepared. Better preparation made customers feel more comfortable that we were in control. We did not panic. We were able to respond quickly. We had the bugs worked out so things went smoothly. We had information readily available. Everyone knew their roles. Correspondence already was written. We just had to fill in the blanks. Then I asked the same question of those people who had weak programs, and this is their responses. We had to think and discuss our next steps. When you're dealing with a crisis or recall, you don't want to have to stop and think and discuss, because that can take a lot of time, and time is very, very critical during these situations. We had to create correspondences on the run. Highly stressed situation. The team was quick to anger. We were not efficient as several team members went off and did the same thing. You maybe had a couple people doing trace exercises or trace activity of the product that was being recalled. So you were not using valuable resources properly. And we sent the wrong message to our customers. The message was we were not in control. So final thoughts before we turn to questions is follow the standard and fulfill all the requirements. The standard does not give you a step-by-step process, so you may need to use other tools to help develop a thorough and effective plan. Document all aspects of your plan. Don't leave anything to memory. If it's a corporate plan, still have that document available, but also know the site requirements, which might be a separate recall plan for that site that ties in to that corporate plan. Make plans accessible to all the team members. Have a hard copy at each team member's desk. You know, we even had a recall crisis team that had access to the plans at home, as normally a crisis or recall does not happen during work hours. I dealt with 5 recalls in my career, and 4 of them happened on the weekend or on Friday afternoon at quitting time. Make a recall program in your computer software programs like I shared just earlier. Practice, practice, practice. It's okay to do more than one required annually. The more you practice it, the more you feel comfortable with doing both plans. And then evaluate for continuous improvement. Again, that's a requirement of the code, and it's a good way to sit back and say, hey, how can we get better? Again, hopefully some of these things I shared will help you be better prepared for a crisis or a recall when it happens, and also it will better prepare you for an audit so you don't get a non-conformance in these areas. So now I guess we turn it over to questions. And it says the first one is, what is your opinion of having the plant or production manager having authority to release product from hold? Do you see this as a conflict of interest? Again, it can be based upon that organization. It is not a best practice because I do believe it's a conflict of interest. I think it should be quality control. But again, some facilities have a strong food safety culture in place, and the plant manager, I've gone to several facilities, I have felt comfortable with the plant manager making that call because there is such a strong food safety culture in place. But in general, I would say it probably should be a quality control, quality assurance manager that makes that call. It says the next one, should a mock recall then include printed mock emails to team or corporate members? I think as much evidence that you can provide to the auditor of all the communication you did, I think is acceptable. One of the best practices, I had a company that did what they called alert crisis contact, and I can't remember the exact name, but it was the way that they alerted all their managers. It was an alert contact system, and they saved those printouts of each one of those contacts that showed this is when that person got contacted, this is when they responded back, and they kept that as evidence. So I would think if you could print out emails, to me, I look at that as having more evidence that you conducted the business continuity plan or the mock recall. How far up the chain should be tested in the business contingency plan? Do you need emails from the CEO? Again, every organization is structured differently. If it's a business continuity plan and the CEO doesn't have any responsibilities other than, doesn't have any specific site responsibilities, I guess, and I'm sitting here thinking about that situation, it'd be best practice to have the CEO respond back, but if he doesn't have any site responsibilities, which if it's a single site and the CEO doesn't have site responsibilities, I would probably challenge that plan in the first place. So I would expect them to have some type of involvement and at least respond back with an email. The next question, any suggestions for managing multiple locations making the same items, best way to conduct a mock recall. The SQF code is a site-specific requirement. So I'm guessing when you say multiple locations, that these are multiple facilities, each of them having their own SQF certificate. And if that's the case, then each facility will have to do their own mock recall. Now, if the mock recall is a group effort, they can possibly do one single mock recall, and that trace exercise that they do will have to be a separate activity from that mock recall. Again, it's how that is structured. So again, you'll still have to have site responsibilities done. So therefore, I'm still going to say I would expect to have a mock recall for each individual site, because you do have site responsibilities that you do have to show evidence for. Do you need to have a root call? The next question, do you need to have a root call simulator for a mock or only for actual mocks? I don't think that's necessary that you have to do that, because you might have something in your notes or in some of your documentation says this would be the team that would investigate that recall, but to go in and do a mock recall, doing a root cause analysis on a make-believe situation, I think very difficult to do. But maybe saying this is the team or this is the person who would conduct that investigation can be a part of your record of that mock recall. The next question, should staff be made aware that there is a recall going on, or is it just the team? Why or why not? This is one that companies handle very differently. My opinion, and I've worked with companies that are transparent and they want to share everything with their people, and they feel that the more they share with their people, the better off that people can respond to questions they have out in public. So I think it's important that you share to your all your internal employees, that they do understand that there's a recall. Now, the details of the recall, again, you might want to keep some of this information back, because sometimes too much information can be too dangerous. But I would at least let your people know there is a recall, that this is how it's being managed, and that the main goal is to get product back and not affecting the safety of your customers. So I would recommend that you share that information. I know a lot of companies don't like to do that. And again, you don't have to do it right away. You can do it once you get the recall planned, and maybe before that first shift goes home, before that second shift goes home, whatever the situation, you communicate and share with your internal staff. How many people should compose the crisis team? Again, I hate to keep saying this, it kind of is based upon your company. If you're a small company, it might only be 3 or 4 people, because that'll cover most. On a small company, I'm talking maybe 50 people or less. What you want to do is make sure, just like your HACCP team that's cross-functional, that you have someone who's going to represent production, someone who's going to represent maybe maintenance, someone who's going to represent customer service. So if you have those different disciplines represented, I don't think it matters how big the team is, as long as you have all those disciplines represented and the roles you define can be carried out by those people on the team. I've seen crisis teams have as little as 5 people, as little as 3 people, and as many as 15. Again, depends upon the size of the organization and the roles and the responsibilities of those people in that organization. Okay, we're just scrolling down through to see if there's any other questions that we haven't answered. We do have contact information up here if you want to discuss. Best way to reach me is by email, because I am on the road a lot. So if you have other questions that you couldn't think of now, feel free to email me. If you have questions on my responses, feel free to email me and say, hey, I'm not quite sure where you're coming from on this, and I'd be more than happy to try to communicate with you and talk to you. I do have another one. The facility that we use is a contracted third-party independent company. The facility has a business continuity plan. Does our corporate business continuity plan still need to address threats to our facility? So that we use is a contracted third-party independent company. So this might be one I need to help. I need that person who wrote that question to maybe email me so I completely understand. The way I'm reading it, that you're renting the facility from an independent company, and if that's the case, again, I don't know how your company's laid out and what type of corporate entity. There's other threats that you have to be aware of besides just the facility threats. So my expectation of this, someone owning the facility, then the threats they would be looking at would be power outages, maybe the location of the facility, but there might be other issues that you have to be concerned about, and you have to look at it from a corporate perspective, like people not showing up to work, terrorist activity inside your disgruntled employee, those type of things that wouldn't be facility generated. If you're talking about a third party handling your business continuity plan, we'd have to talk in more detail about that one so I completely understand their role and what they're actually doing for you. So sorry I couldn't answer that one completely. I got a question. Some mock recalls cause production interruptions. Please provide some examples of the mock crisis that do not affect the production or would be an acceptable exercise. Okay, I want to separate mock recalls and mock crises. I'm looking at it as two different questions. A mock recall is looking at recalling product, and that can be a completely tabletop exercise, and a mock crisis can be a completely tabletop exercise. The only time that I can see a mock crisis not being completely a tabletop exercise is if you do a weather threat, like a tornado or a fire threat, where you want to actually have people go to tornado shelters or evacuate the building. That would be something that would shut production down and part of that crisis management. So again, a lot of times people do that on a regular basis anyhow. So most of your crises will be tabletop exercises. It'll be, here's a scenario, and you walk through your process, and you don't shut down production from that standpoint. So, but if your plan involves evacuation and you want to test it and make sure that people evacuate the plant successfully, then that would cause that. But again, the code doesn't say you have to do the fire drills every year, or you don't have to do a tornado drill every year. For business continuity plan, how much of a physical test is required? For example, if we simulate a fire tornado, do we actually have to limit access to areas, stop production, put production on hold, or can we simulate portions of the test at the desk? I think I just answered that. You can simulate portions at the desk. Now, what you might want to do, I just was at a facility a week ago that hardly ever puts product on hold because the product has to ship out like within 24 hours of the product being made, and they don't put anything on hold. So in that situation, I would say, hey, you at least want to fill out those hold tags and stuff because it's not a practice you normally do. So you might want to run that through your process. You might want to practice that. But in most situations, it would be a tabletop exercise, and I wouldn't carry putting stuff on hold unless you want to test your system. If you have product that goes on hold in a hold system and you want to test that system, that's the only time you get a chance to do that, then I would do that. Do it whatever fits your process. What constitutes adequate training for the business continuity team? Is third-party training required? The code does not spell out what specific training is required. I think a best practice, would be third-party training and having someone explain the benefits of business continuity plan tests, that type of stuff. But I really truly believe looking at your program, reviewing the roles of that program is considered training for that business continuity plan. Maybe if you want to give them background on why these plans are important, maybe even sharing this presentation can be part of that training, I think is beneficial. But really, reviewing the plan itself, looking at the roles and responsibilities, in my eyes, would be part of that training program. Can you explain the documentation that you would recommend for a mock incident test? I would document as much as I possibly can, and I shared several times during the presentation the type of training I would expect, the type of documentation I would expect for some type of mock exercise. I would expect some type of record that whether it's a checklist, whether it's writing on the procedure, whether it's a narrative of the activities that you conducted, all the discussions that went on with your tabletop exercise, and then also providing those extra documents like someone asked if they should include emails. I would include emails. Print out some alert contacts if you have the alert contact system in place, those type of printouts. Mock press releases, mock recall notifications. All these type of things that you can generate would be records that you conducted that mock recall or that mock crisis plan. And those would be records I would expect to see, and I think it would benefit you to have as many records as you possibly can to support that, especially with the mock recall, to support that you did a mock recall and just not a trace exercise. Can a mock recall serve as an annual business continuity plan test? No, they're two separate activities. In the original part of SQF, people might have accepted that as part of the business continuity plan, but it's clearly spelled out in the code by having two requirements, one's for business continuity plan, one's for recall, that you need to do two different tests. And even if you look in the guidance, it spells out specifically that people get a business continuity plan confused with a recall plan, and that's mentioned in the guidance document for Module 2. So, no, you have to do separate tests for each one. Does SQFI webinar attendance qualify as an example of continuous improvement activity? I think it does, from the standpoint that you're trying to improve the knowledge of the code. And again, you want to have this continuous improvement, you want to have it documented and available to your auditor when they come to see. But I think whenever you enhance your education, would I just stop at that as training? No, I'd expect other things to be continuously improved. But again, you're increasing the strength of either yourself or the team. And if you're the SQF practitioner, to me, that's continuously improving and strengthening that position. So I think it's a piece. And it can be a part of that, but don't just rest everything on that. According to the code, I need at least 1 year of mock recall. Well, what's the requirement of mock recall withdrawal? Just one for both is acceptable. You don't have to do a withdrawal. A withdrawal is basically a recall that's not as specific, it doesn't create an adverse situation. So if you do a mock recall, you're probably doing more things than you would do just for your mock withdrawal. So just doing one exercise is sufficient, and I would do your mock recall. Would it not be better to have an adulterated product isolated and destroyed rather than trying to rework it? In today's day and age, I would not rework anything that was on a recall. And that's just my personal opinion, because then I think you're opening yourself up for, especially if it's a pathogen type situation and you can take care of it from cooking, I still don't think it's the best practice. So I think it's more from destroying that product. But again, that's my opinion. If you can destroy it, show evidence that's been, if you can rework it, show evidence that you reworked it, you took care of the hazard that was there for the recall, then that's your decision as a company to make. But I highly recommend not to do that. If you have a product withdrawal, do you still have to let the certification body know? I think it's a best practice, even if you have a withdrawal. But again, the way the code, and I don't have the code spelled right out in front of me, the way the code spells out is, let me just look here real quick. I don't want to give you a real quick wrong answer. When in doubt, go to the code. It says, upon identification that a certain certified supplier initiates a food safety event that requires public notification, and it represents it as a Class 1 or Class 2 recall, so it doesn't include Class 3, or receipt of a regulatory warning letter, then the supplier shall notify the CB and SQFI. Still think it's a best practice because, again, you want to make sure your certification body is aware of what's going on in your operation, but it's not a requirement. Why is it important to communicate the recall to the CB? Does the CB take any action, and what is the purpose? Yes, there's a couple different things. One, if you followed any of the recalls that we've had with like the Jensen brothers and that type of stuff, the certification bodies get brought into investigations, they get brought into liability issues. So if we know that up ahead of time and we can prepare ourselves, as I said, Eagle has a crisis management plan. So whenever we get a recall notification, depending upon the seriousness of that recall, we gather together as a team and we we develop a talking point on what we would do if we have media come to us or anything like that. So it helps the CB and SQFI prepare for any kind of situation. It also helps us track, do we have any trends showing that, hey, maybe we can do a better job as a certification body and as an auditor to help our clients identify weaknesses in their system. And then thirdly, we have to notify SQF to see if there's any kind of action we have to take. You know, if you have a recall that has multiple deaths, then we might have to look and might have to go in there to do a unannounced audit to make sure that things are under control so there's no threat to your certification. So all those are reasons why the certification body has to be notified and why they need to be part of that notification. Is a mock recall on primary packaging required? Is one on raw materials and finished products sufficient? Oh, okay, I see what you're talking. For trace exercises, I'm going to jump on you. Trace exercises, I would do trace exercises on my primary packaging. To do a mock recall, again, you want to do scenarios that are likely to happen. So if you don't think there's going to be a scenario where primary packaging is going to create any problems, then I probably wouldn't do a mock recall scenario where it involves primary packaging. But when you look at trace exercises, you do want to test that system to make sure you have trace exercises for your packaging materials documented. So you don't have to include it as a mock recall, but you do want to show evidence that you can trace your packaging materials back and forth and have a trace exercise geared towards packaging materials. So when you say sanitation records, you mean just records that were kept during the time the recall product was being run? Yes. It would be only during that time in which that product was run. So any HACCP records, if you identify the recall product was recall product from February 14th, 2016, that would be the only records that I would involve in my recall documentation.
Hey, Roger, this is Leslie from SQFI. Unfortunately, I think we are going to have to stop now. It's now 1:36 p.m. But for everyone else that's on the line that still had a question that we did not have the time to answer, just make sure that you write down Roger's contact information so that he can follow up with you. And thank you so much to everyone that joined us for today's webinar, and also to Roger and Eagle Certification Group for presenting and for sponsoring today's topic. Please keep in mind that we did record this event, and we will have this in the Q&A session. It's all in one video, and it will be posted to our website and also our YouTube channel by the end of this Friday. So sorry to interrupt you there, Roger. But thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for attending, and I hope you guys have a great day.